as a historical theologian, I've been thinking about, if you will, the ways of Orthodox theology in the 20th century for quite a while, possibly for the last 10 years. And about 5 years ago, I conceived it, my plan was essentially to continue Father Georges Florovsky's Ways of Russian Theology, essentially continue it with the authors that he has uncovered in that particular volume, famous volume, and essentially covered 20th century authors, beginning with a generation of people like Bulgakov and Berdyaev, and then moving to the generation of Florovsky and then Shmeman, and then present-day theologians like Yanaras and Zizoulas. But the more I read Florovsky's presentation of the matter, the more I realized that his own narrative of the ways of Orthodox theology had to be rethought. That what we needed first is actually a change of perspective, and without that change of perspective, we actually could not move forward in understanding what's happening in the 20th century. And so the result was somewhat of a surprise to me. The result was a monograph on Georges Florovsky under the title Florovsky and the Russian Religious Renaissance. And so I'll say a few things about how this book came to be, what I take the Russian Religious Renaissance to be, and then also what I, if you will, take to be the questions that the book still leaves unanswered. So if you were to ask me 20 years ago what would be my first book on a significant figure in the Russian intellectual tradition, I would probably say Dostoevsky, Berdyaev, Bulgakov, Losky, and possibly Shmeman. So Florovsky would actually make the cut of the first 5. Solovyov might very well be sort of added to the mix. He wouldn't make the cut because to this day, I also believe that he was primarily a historian. But the more I read his material, and actually the more I engaged with contemporary Orthodox thought, the more I realized that Florovsky became an inescapable landmark, an inescapable point of departure for so many conversations in contemporary theology. So the pain in my brain was this: how is it possible for somebody like Florovsky to throw the idea out there, and that is this idea of the neo-patristic synthesis or neo-patristic theology, without developing it properly methodologically, without really telling the world what is at stake in the recovery of the Fathers as a grand research project, and for the idea to catch on, and to catch on to such an extent that today neo-patristic theology and neo-patristics remains the main direction of Orthodox theology. It's entirely possible that this is going to be a permanent feature of Orthodox theology, because we will never be able to move beyond the Fathers, to the extent to which what you have in the patristic tradition bears witness to the divine revelation. There's no way in which we could somehow supersede the Church Fathers. Now, that said, still, of course, lots of questions remain unresolved, and so it's certainly not enough to simply repeat the Fathers. So on the one hand, you've got Florovsky, who simply throws in some powerful idea and people run with it. On the other hand, you have people like Bulgakov, who in several thousand pages develops what one could call an absolute system. And that system just collects the dust in the next generation. I wouldn't say that nobody pays attention to it, but people largely, within the Orthodox Church, largely ignore it. Now, I should be clear that in the past 20 years, Bulgakov's heritage has received a new life. New editions of his writings are published, new translations appear, and especially with English and other Western European language translations, there's certainly a hope that his heritage would again be received somehow. And I think at the end of the day, Bulgakov will remain a kind of an agent provocateur, a kind of a Russian origin, if you will. If you can compare Vladimir Solovyov to something like a Russian Plato, then what you have in Bulgakov is Russian origin. So just as the study of origin is really a kind of an inescapable enterprise for anybody who tries to get into the world of the Cappadocian Fathers, for example, or Augustine. I think the same applies to the role of Bulgakov. In other words, in order to understand Losky and Florovsky, in order to understand the fathers of neo-patristic theology, you have to also understand Bulgakov and grapple with Bulgakov and understand that they were essentially replying to him. And so that they were not simply innocently drinking at the sources, at the patristic sources, and simply forgetting everything else that was happening in their own theological world, but rather that what they were doing were concrete responses to Bulgakov. And so, for example, what Florovsky describes as the intuition of creaturehood, this claim that created order is fundamentally contingent and it's temporal and it's historically dependent, and that new forms arise in the created order that are genuinely new, that are not an outgrowth of something pre-existing, and that God fundamentally, qualitatively, is different from that sort of reality, that God, by precisely virtue of being eternal and non-transcendent, is qualitatively different. That insight, that what Florovsky calls intuiция тварности in Russian, or the intuition of creaturehood, well, that particular idea was articulated in response to Bulgakov's sophiology that saw every creature as somehow divinely founded, as somehow having roots or foundation in the uncreated life of God. So when Bulgakov, if you will, fudges the distinction between created and uncreated, Florovsky wants to restore it and restore clarity to that distinction. So that's just one example. And Florovsky himself admits that his articulation of the doctrine of creation was directly stimulated by the work of Pavel Florensky, and particularly Florensky's Pillar in the Ground of the Truth. But beyond that, also his conversations and his reaction to Bulgakov. So the book tries to understand Florovsky within the context of the movement that he ultimately rejected, and that's the Russian religious Renaissance. And this was the movement that started in the 1890s, so approximately 125 years ago. It was led by people like Berdyaev, Bulgakov, Merezhkovsky, Rozanov, and others. And the purpose of the movement was tremendously ambitious. It was a transformation of all aspects of intellectual culture, and that included arts, that included literature, that included poetry, it included theater. It included, for Bulgakov, because he begins as an economist, it included economics, and it certainly included political theory. So all aspects of human existence were meant to be transformed by the gospel. Now, the critics of the movement said that as a result, actually, the movement itself was greatly influenced by experimentation with new forms of religion. So Merezhkovsky's circle developed this idea of the third covenant and somehow some sort of supersession of the gospel by this revelation of the Spirit. So it's true that there were lots of crazy ideas that were entertained by the Renaissance figures, but it's also true that the Renaissance spiritually woke Florovsky up. And so before Florovsky becomes a patristic scholar, and this is how we know him today, he is first and foremost an avid reader of Vladimir Solovyov. And so what's clear with early Florovsky is the extent to which Solovyov's thought influences him and the extent to which he takes Solovyov to be expressive of the Eastern patristic tradition. Later in life, and I argue that this happened in 1922, 1923, Florovsky actually is going to renounce Solovyov in the most sort of dramatic manner. And that renunciation of Solovyov's heritage as monistic, deterministic, awfully theosophical, based on non-ecclesial forms of mysticism, so dabbling into questionable mysticism. So that particular rejection will sort of stay with Florovsky throughout his whole life. And having rejected Solovyov as a kind of a crypto-German idealist and monist, Florovsky has also rejected the whole tradition that built on Solovyov, including his own teacher and mentor, Bulgakov. So the book has elements of intellectual biography. So it looks at, specifically in great detail, it looks at Florovsky's European period, which is a period from 1920 to 1948. 1920 is when Florovsky came from Odessa, and this is southern Russian Empire at the time, hands of the Bolsheviks. So when he fled essentially from the Red Army in Odessa, first to Bulgaria, to Sofia, and then subsequently to Prague, and then eventually to Paris. And then he leaves Paris, he leaves Europe after the war in 1948, and then comes to the United States and becomes immensely influential in bringing about St. Vladimir's and making St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary what it is today. So in Florovsky we have somebody who had a hand in the building of the major theological institutions in the West, including Saint-Serge, in which he worked since 1926, St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in the state of New York, and also the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary in Brookline, Massachusetts. In all three, he taught at all three of these establishments, and then he subsequently also taught at Harvard and retired to Princeton. But he certainly had a hand in developing the course, the intellectual course, of at least the first two establishments, and that's Saint-Serge in Paris and also St. Vladimir's in New York. So he was obviously a prominent churchman. Lots of things that are associated with him that are of great significance, but the main, of course, idea for which he will be remembered is this concept of neo-patristic synthesis. And in the book, I go at great length to unpack what Florovsky meant by it and to systematize the things that he left very often in a kind of a rhapsodic and asystematic manner.